Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty leagues, PPR leagues, IDP leagues, even daily fantasy football leagues. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be bringing you all of your fantasy football news as we get through this offseason. We are kind of in the middle of free agency right now. We're going to get through the draft, and we're going to talk about all these new players going to be coming into your fantasy football world, into the NFL, and who's going to bring you the most points and help you win your league this coming season. I'm your host, Tom Dougherty, and in this episode we're going to be talking about the rookies and different rookies to be watching for coming into the draft, and then looking at which teams they can maybe fall on, which teams are going to help them score the most points in their fantasy, who's going to complement who, and who's going to look the best in their rookie season. Obviously, we had some rookies last year, or the number one rookie last year. I think, well, obviously, fantasy-wise, had to be Alvin Kamara. Down in New Orleans. That tandem with Mark Ingram was definitely a good thing to have on your fantasy team. Both of them were putting up some serious points down there for the New Orleans Saints. For those people in the PPR leagues, you must have loved Alvin Kamara because he caught almost everything out of the backfield with great hands, was able to get down the field and get some extended plays with those yards after the catch, which is exactly what you want. After you get that 1 point for the catch, and then obviously some yards for him running. So looking at the draft, we have a great stock of running backs. Take a peek over to my college football edition podcast of the football, or GSMC football podcast I did yesterday. I did a college football edition and talked a lot about the running backs and also the quarterbacks coming out in the draft this year. I don't think any of the quarterbacks are really going to have much fantasy implication this coming season. Sam Darnold likely, he could play this season coming up if he gets drafted by the Browns, but they also have Tyrod, so they could sit him behind Tyrod for a year. So you never kind of know what's going to go on in Cleveland. But as far as running backs, those guys seem to get in the starting lineup as soon as they can, especially Saquon Barkley, likely going to get started wherever he goes, at least be a tandem with somebody else, or have those carries split with somebody else. I mean, the whole idea that the split carries is something to watch out for. You do want to watch out for it because it can lead to some down days, down weeks, but you also want to have your guy fresh. You want to make sure he's going to get those big runs, that get in the end zone. Obviously, it's kind of have to figure it out. It's kind of a gamble, seeing if they are going to split carries, which guy is going to end up getting pay dirt and getting in the end zone. That's where you're going to see, obviously, a lot of your points. But, I mean, we saw last year, like I was talking about before, with Kamara and with Ingram, you can get points wherever, even if they're getting lots of yards. If you're gonna, like I said, the PPR, get some yards off, get some ones off of those catches, and then having a guy like Barkley with his good hands. I mean, his coaches come out and said that he pretty much has all the tools, whether it's his hands, it's his power, his legs. I mean, his ability to get through defenses, tackles, and then obviously get through those small holes that are being blocked for him. So Saquon, definitely someone to look for. I wouldn't obviously put him in the first round, maybe not yet as a first round running back. My first round running back this year is likely going to be Todd Gurley or Kareem Hunt if I had a choice. I picked Gurley last year in my league. He won me my league basically last year with those really, really strong last few weeks of the season. So we're going to have to see what's going to happen in the draft and where Barkley's going to go. And regarding to that, we'll probably give us more of a picture on as to what kind of fantasy player he's going to be in this upcoming season. Continuing with the running backs, I talked about him on the last show as well, Sony Michel, kind of a similar kind of running back as we have with Barkley, that guy who's going to be more of a speedy back, sneaking through those small holes, also going to be catching the ball out of the backfield. So if you are, like I said, in that PPR league, you love those running backs to catch the ball. Like Todd Gurley had probably about 5 or 6 catches a game last year out of the backfield. So you got to love those catches out of the backfield. Those are automatic points for you. For those not in the PPR league, you might want to look at somebody like Darius Geis or Nick Chubb. He's going to get a lot of yards on the ground. Going to have those good power runs if they ever a guy up on the goal line, being maybe 3 yards or closer to the old goal line there. You are going to like somebody like that because he's going to be a bruiser who's going to be given the rock and be able to pound it into the end zone there and get you your points that way. So just take a look at some of those running backs. We also have Kerryon Johnson, likes to catch out of the backfield as well. Get some points for PPR people. To get to the quarterbacks, like I said, I don't really think any quarterbacks are going to have much to say this coming season. Maybe next season we'll get to that probably throughout the season, the next offseason, if we're going to have some of these rookie quarterbacks coming up. To finish going throughout the segment, we're talking more about the rookies. So I'll talk more about we have some receivers coming out. We have Calvin Ridley, who's going to be a big deal coming out of Alabama. He's going to have that probably at least a chance to have a second receiver job. So if you're looking at a receiver for a late round pick to see if you can kind of work him in through some buys, if you want to maybe diversify your bye week, find out which team drafted him and take him because he's a talented receiver. If you want to look at those rookie receivers, we had Corey Davis last year come out as a rookie receiver. He was mighty good. So we have some options there in the draft. I haven't gotten quite done with the running backs yet. We still have Ronald Jones from USC. I'm not sure what kind of fantasy implications he's going to have. He might be a guy where you're going to see him drop in the draft a little more and get drafted by a team like maybe the Patriots or a Saints team. Well, they're actually pretty good at running back. So I'm thinking the Patriots because they lost their main guy in Deion Lewis over to the Titans. But you have to think about teams that are drafting later. They're drafting later for a reason because their offenses are more complete. Their teams are more complete. They finished better last season. So you want to get somebody like Ronald Jones Jr. out of USC into a place where he can at least share carries, not be the main guy, but he's going to be another guy, like I said, Nick Chubb and who else did I say? Oh, Darius Geis from LSU to be the guy to get the ball on the 1 yard line and punch it in from there. So you'll get some points from those touchdowns. Those short yardage touchdowns are really nice. Todd Gurley had his fair share of those last year as well. So those are kind of going over the running backs there. So we'll continue with the kind of looking at the rookie class here. We have that defensive player. I mean, the defenses are an interesting thing. So you have to look at this. Minkah Fitzpatrick, if he goes to the Browns, their defense, I mean, I like to rotate defenses throughout the year. We'll see what I mean, I don't like sticking necessarily with one defense, rotating them out, seeing which defense is playing well, going off matchups. If you really go off matchups, that's kind of what you want. You can kind of do every all year. That's what I did all year. You'll find that you'll yield a lot of points based off of which team is playing an offensive team. So kind of, I had a stretch last year where basically I just picked up whoever was playing the Browns. Not even kidding. Just to be honest, like whoever was playing the Browns, pick them up, or maybe even like Cincinnati, because you want a team that's susceptible to turnovers. Necessarily, you'll find out that a lot of defenses around the NFL can create turnovers. There are teams more than not. They've got like Tennessee last year. You probably had like 20 picks because that their secondary was crazy. But you have to look at a team and find out which offense is most susceptible to giving up turnovers, and then you could find out if you can pick them up maybe through waivers every week, which is exactly what I did, and it's not a bad technique there regarding defenses. So speaking of defenses, I was talking about Minkah Fitzpatrick. If he goes somewhere like Cleveland, he might shore up that defense. They might be an interesting pick up maybe not a draft pickup, but definitely something you can think about going out throughout the season to think about regarding matchups and defenses depending on who they're playing that week. So definitely something to think about. Quentin Nelson, you don't really get much thought when you talk about linemen and fantasy football. He's always going to help your quarterback. Obviously, you have a quarterback with Quentin Nelson on the line, you can think better about yourself a little more. I mean, if that's some deep thinking right there when it comes to fantasy football, usually you just look at the quarterback stats, but you got to make sure your quarterback stays healthy. I had Aaron Rodgers last year on my team. I picked him first, because I just wanted to get the quarterback out of the way there, even though it's getting more trendy to pick quarterbacks later in the draft because there's just so many of them that can put up good numbers. I also picked Big Ben, like my last pick in the draft, and I ended up having to run with him the end of the year because Aaron obviously got hurt, and that's my whole point here is that Aaron, you need to be able to protect your quarterbacks going into the draft. So speaking of injured quarterbacks, we'll finish up this segment talking about Deshaun Watson and how I think he's going to have a bounce-back year. If he can stay healthy, he's had 2 knee injuries now, but he's still got that talent. He's got that ability to stay in the pocket. He's got the Texans defense behind him to back him up, and then he's also got some serious weapons in Sammy Watkins. So if you're looking to draft a backup quarterback, I wouldn't necessarily put him in your as a starting list. Depends if you're playing on that 10-man league or 12-man league. Maybe you would pick him as a starter because there's not much left after that, especially if it's like the last pick or you end up losing out. There's nobody left on your board. But in an 8-man league, I'd likely put him in like second slot. I'd have him on the bench, just ready for somebody. If you're going to have your starter not have the same bye as him, that would be silly if you draft a starter with the same bye as your backup. We don't do that in fantasy football. But I would definitely think of something for him to find if he can get on that same level of last year where you're going to start seeing some serious points where, again, it's all about those matchups. If you see him against a defense that's not as fast, it's a little slower defense that's going to sit back and maybe not get him as much pressure where he can run around, because that's another thing. Quarterbacks, you're going to get those points on the ground. It's more efficient to get points on the ground for a quarterback if he's running because you get more points per yard on those runs. So if you have a running quarterback like Deshaun, assuming he can get back healthy, at least probably by maybe week 3, I think they were saying with his ACL takes about a year, or 9 months to it, depending on how he's starting to rehab already. Same thing with Carson Wentz. Obviously, Carson Wentz, big breakout year last year until he got hurt. Going to be interesting to see how his draft stock in these fantasy leagues fares regarding his injury. Coming off that injury, he's not going to be starting the year. It's going to be Nick Foles starting the year for the Eagles, the defending Super Bowl champion Eagles, who have a lot of players on their team who you have to think about as fantasy implications. Obviously, Corey Clement is a good little pick, and then you have just definitely there are 2 other running backs with Blunt and Jay Ajayi having to be good picks if you're looking at a second running back, maybe in the 3rd or 4th round. Getting to the receivers, we're talking about the Eagles still here with Alshon Jeffrey. I like their young receiver they got on the other side, Hollins. So he's going to be a guy I think I would look for in like the later rounds if you're looking for a 3rd receiver or a flex guy. Depending on that, you always got to think about your bye weeks. You're trying to diversify those bye weeks. So if you want to think about it like that, you got to be able to have some guys that's going to be a surprise, or maybe somebody goes down and becomes a number 2 or number 3, or number 1 receiver. So you got to think about those guys out there. Obviously, I can always just tell you, just pick AB, just pick Martavis Bryant. Obviously they're on the same team, but just pick the Steelers offense. I can just tell you to do that, but that's not interesting. That's pretty self-explanatory right there. Pick Le'Veon, pick Antonio Brown. That's what you should do. No, you need to have some diversification in your on your lineup. You need to have a few receivers who are maybe not be the number 1 receiver on their team, but might have a hot day where they're going to have to catch like 9 balls and get in the end zone, because we're seeing now these days with these quarterbacks are so good, they're able to find everybody. Whoever's open, they're going to find somebody, and you're going to see a guy like Zach Hollins get in the end zone a few different times this year. And it's all about finding those points everywhere you can, because that's this fantasy game. I've seen too many games where there's depending if you have the decimals going to the 10th place or the 100th place, or if you don't have decimals at all, where you have ties or you're losing by 1 point. You need to find some diversification. You need to find it in these rookies coming out in the draft, and you need to find it in these in more of these younger players that might be the second or third receiver or second running back on their team, because they're going to get the carries too. It's all about making sure those lineups turn over, because that's what the new NFL is doing. They're not just sticking with the same 11 guys every time on the field. They're moving guys in and out of there. They're changing up packages and offenses all the time. So you're going to find your points, and you're going to find them in the guys that can get open and have the talent to get in the end zone. All right. So that's going to finish up our first segment. We talked a little bit about the receivers that I liked coming out, kind of a little sleeper. I threw one out there from the defending world champion Eagles, and then I'll talk about the rookie running backs. When we come back from the break, I'm going to go over some of these maybe second-tier quarterbacks. The top-tier quarterbacks are pretty much already decided, but how about second-tier quarterbacks? Let's rank those guys, and then maybe in the third segment, we're going to talk about Tom Brady and his likely maybe his final season or his second final season, and how he can just keep this sustained success, and how he's stayed a pretty healthy fantasy player. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and welcome back on in here to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Last segment, we talked a little bit about the running backs coming out in this draft that I like, and I like their fantasy implications, as they're just talking about the different ways they're going to get points, whether you're a PPR league looking for a running back that's going to catch the ball out of the backfield, or, obviously everybody likes a little running back that is going to get the ball at the 1 yard line and pound it in for a touchdown. That's always nice. But if you're not a PPR league, you want a guy who's going to get those yards on the ground. Those are the valuable yards on the ground. You get more points per yard. So you're looking for somebody who might not be sharing the wealth, but is going to get the bulk of the carries coming out of the draft. All right, in this segment, I'm going to talk about kind of our second-tier quarterbacks. I can identify the top-tier quarterbacks, and you can put them in however order you want, but in fantasy, they all kind of even out when you talk about your Rodgers and your Brady and your Ben Roethlisberger, or even your Russell Wilson. Sometimes those guys do well, sometimes they don't. Sometimes Drew Brees will have 45 points. Well, actually, Drew Brees is one of the more consistent fantasy players. It's just how the Saints operate. Especially if you're looking at how many times he can complete the ball to a receiver and get however many yards he can off that. So we're looking at our second-tier quarterbacks. I'm talking like Marcus Mariota, and I'm talking these younger guys like Jameis Winston. Maybe even I wouldn't know. Is Cam still that's the question of the day. Is Cam Newton still a top-tier fantasy quarterback? I don't know. I had him a couple years ago, and he disappointed me a little bit. He's definitely hit or miss. He came back finished strong last season. He started off a little flat, came in strong last season with his fantasy numbers, but the key with Cam Newton is the fact that he needs to get those ground yardage as well. Just like I was talking about with Deshaun Watson in the last segment, he needs to get those ground yardages as well, and then also he needs to be able to pinpoint that ball down the field and get those big passing yardages too, because he's lacking on those 40-yard plays, because that's where you're going to get your bonuses, those big longer plays, 40 or 50 yards. So you got to be able to see if Cam's going to get back to where he was when his MVP season was, because he definitely has regressed, and I mean maybe even regressed down into that second tier of quarterback. Derek Carr, another guy right on the bubble, was hurt at the end of not last season but the season before, and then came back and had a kind of a disappointing season. The Raiders all did kind of all together, definitely finishing underneath their expected win total. And coming in now with a 10th pick in the draft, I think they went 6-10 last season. So Derek Carr, he'll put up his points. He needs to see if he can get some weapons. Amari Cooper had another down year. He needs to get Amari Cooper going on the outside to be able to get those hooked up, those completions, get in the end zone more often to rack up those points. But I think what Derek Carr really needs is to have a running back that he could throw to out of the backfield, because he's gonna be a guy that's gonna move around a lot in the pocket. He's gonna buy his time, and then if you could find a running back who's gonna find his soft spot in the zone, or even a tight end who found a soft spot in the zone. Like they had Jared Cook last year. He didn't really get much going either, probably dealing with a little injury issues. But Derek Carr, he definitely on the bubble there of the top tier, second tier quarterbacks when it comes to the draft. I know in my league I play with a Raider fan, so he usually just takes Derek Carr first round or second round regardless, so I don't really even think about him. He's never really been on my draft board before. I tend to stick with the Blue Bloods. And it's kind of getting my quarterback out of the way, because that's just how sometimes our league is structured, the fact that the quarterbacks are just the most valuable commodities in the league, because they're just you find a guy who is passing a lot and maybe doesn't have as much running support, where he's going to just drop back 40, 50 times a game. Looking at some more second tier quarterbacks fantasy wise, we have Kirk Cousins going to a new city and going to Minneapolis to play for the Vikings. So it's going to be interesting to see if Kirk will utilize those really good weapons he was given. He's been given now with the Vikings with Stephon Diggs and Kyle Rudolph. I mean, he's going to have and Adam Thielen as well. He'll have Alvin Cook back, the running back who got hurt last year out of Florida State, as another running back to watch to see if we can have a bounce back year. That Minnesota Vikings offense is going to be one to watch when it comes to fantasy. Also, their defense as well, defensive implications as well. We could talk about the Vikings for a while if we wanted to. When it comes to fantasy, they're one of my favorite teams when it comes to fantasy implications, is they're going to rack up a lot of points, and they're probably going to hold teams to small totals as well because of their vaunted defense. And then we'll just have to see how Kirk Cousins clicks with that offense, if they can get him going. Regarding just that's going to be a team. It's going to be interesting though. If you want to take, I wouldn't take Kirk Cousins as my number one quarterback as well. Obviously, he's not going to have enough pass time, so I don't think they're definitely going to manage him. More than not, they're going to have that running back tandem with Latavius Murray and Dalvin Cook to offset that passing game with Kirk Cousins. But you know what? The guy likes a big play. If you're looking for somebody to get those big play bonuses, that's all what Kirk Cousins is for. I mean, he's got some serious weapons on the outside, and then obviously a very talented tight end in Kyle Rudolph to find those soft spots. I mean, that's my I think that's my tight end of the week. Pick of the week probably is going to be Kyle Rudolph coming into the season. I like him to have a big season. He could probably get in the end zone maybe 10, 12 times this year, which is some pretty good points. To have Kyle Rudolph as a tight end would be a nice little pick there. Maybe even third round or fourth round whenever you decide you're going to start looking for tight ends. But yeah, that's the Vikings for you. Stephon Diggs, I don't know. He's been known obviously for that one catch he made against the Saints in the playoffs. But that's the playoffs. That does not really count in your fantasy game. You got to be thinking about week to week how much what's he going to do, racking up. He's going to stay consistent, because that's really what fantasy football is. It's a lot of consistency. You got to make sure that you're racking up, putting up numbers every week, or having guys that are going to put up numbers every week, because that's how you're going to be able to stay on top of your league and get wins every week. I mean, it's tough to win every week, obviously, in fantasy, because you have so much volatility and it's hard to guess and set your lineup, and you have projections that are trying to mislead you and everything. I'll probably do a whole show on how much I hate projections next week. because I really do hate projections. The fact that they're just so misleading, and they're trying to help. They almost discourage you from playing the player you should play, and you really just need to go off of what you know versus what they're telling you should know, based off of the matchup. So I mean, just take it for what it is. Stephon Diggs, see what you can do. Adam Thielen obviously had a breakout year. Was a great fantasy player last year. Led to a lot of defeats for me. Well, two against the guy who had Adam Thielen. I mean, because he was just putting up major points for that guy left and right every week last year. So we'll see if Adam Thielen can not bounce back, but just come back with a better year than he did last year, because you always want to get better. But I mean, another year like they did last year would just be fine as well, fantasy wise. So that's the Vikings for you. Dalvin Cook, though, just to get to him really quick as a running back, he is interesting because he's coming back from a year of injury. We'll see how he's going to come back from that injury he sustained. He kind of just missed his rookie year. So, I mean, either that's going to be a thing where he's going to be rusty when he comes back, or he's going to bounce right back in and use that talent to rack up some points. I mean, he's going to be a guy where he's going to have to share time with Latavius Murray. You're going to have to figure out which I wouldn't draft probably either of them, but you're going to have to figure out which running back is going to be the guy in the short yardage, which guy is going to be running back for your big plays in the passing game. I mean, if you're looking for that, those big catches and for those big yards out of the backfield, you got to figure out which one they're going to use which. I mean, they had Jerick McKinnon leave for San Francisco in the offseason and free agency. So you have to figure out if they're going to either split those guys and have one just be that kind of receiving scat back who's going to go out in the plat or out in the screen game, or have both of them kind of just alternate carries. So I think they're going to obviously ease Dalvin Cook back, and Latavius might get more of the carries in the beginning, so you probably would want to look at him early and then see if you can come around to Dalvin later in the draft, or maybe just see if he goes undrafted and try and pick him up later in the season. We'll see if he's even healthy come draft day, which is a long way off for us. I mean, fantasy football, though, is a good thing to talk about all year round, because there's stuff going on in the NFL all the time. I mean, what are we going to do with these rookies? I talked about it in the first segment. I don't think any of them, maybe Sam Darnold is going to come out if we don't want to talk quarterbacks, but all these guys are going to be interesting to watch, as they are going to be sitting on the bench likely for a year or two, or might have to get called up to the starting lineup if there's any injuries. I mean, it's the NFL. It's a league of injuries. You got to deal with your injuries, and if you have a quarterback who you drafted, like Lamar Jackson, say, if the Arizona Cardinals draft Lamar Jackson and Sam Bradford doesn't make it through Week 10, are you going to play Lamar Jackson? And then what's Lamar Jackson's fantasy implications? I mean, that's going to be interesting. He's a guy who I think can be a big fantasy player, because he's obviously, I was talked about before, with those legs and the fact that he can run and get those more valuable yards throughout on the ground, and figure out what he is worth in the fantasy game, especially for the season, for next season starting in 2019. So it's going to be interesting to see whether he's going to have to play this season wherever. I mean, assuming if he goes to if he goes to the Cardinals, or if he's going to have to sit the whole first season, then we'll figure out what kind of fantasy player he is when he gets on the field. Regarding players who already are on the field and already are playing, we got to get back to those second-tier quarterbacks. I mean, we kind of touched on a couple of them, like Derek Carr, and I want to talk about Marcus Mariota a little bit, because Marcus Mariota is an interesting player where, again, I'm still bringing up these guys who can kind of run a little bit and get some yardage through the running game, and get some maybe touchdowns through the running game. And Marcus Mariota definitely is capable of that. He's got some serious wheels. I mean, he threw a touchdown to himself last year in the playoffs, and he even had a few running touchdowns during the season. I mean, those running touchdowns for quarterbacks are pretty nice, especially if you're playing a guy who has the receiver on the same team. Like, what if you're playing somebody that has Corey Davis and you have Marcus Mariota? Those points cancel out. However, Marcus Mariota just runs it in. Those points are all for you. So you got to figure that out. whether you like Marcus as a starting quarterback or if you're going to put him as your backup and then start him when your starter is going to be on a bye, or if your starter gets injured. So the thing about fantasy, it is kind of fluid. The draft, I don't know how many players I still have from the draft on my team last year. Obviously, I had Gurley, but I definitely rotated a bunch of different players in there. It's all about the adds and drops, finding those guys on waivers. Finding out when you have a good waiver number where you can get that hot player who just came off a good week, or you think is going to have a good matchup coming up in that week. So, I mean, that happens with everything, positions all across the board, especially quarterbacks. If you're looking at somebody who's coming into a bye week, your starter's coming into a bye week. So maybe don't even draft a second quarterback in the draft. Maybe just stick with your starter, wait till his bye week, pick up a guy off the waivers, then go back to your starter after his bye week. I mean, that's kind of what you'd hope you can do, especially if you're in a bigger league where it's tough to draft two quarterbacks when you need to worry about your other positions, because there's a lot more players and teams. Like if you're a 12-man league, you're going to run out of talent pretty quickly regarding fantasy talent. I'm talking because there's a lot of talent in the NFL, but not everybody is a great fantasy player because it's all circumstantial. You got to make sure you're in the right situation where this player is going to get his touches, he's going to get his catches, get his carries. Quarterbacks are different, but when it comes to tight ends, receivers, and running backs, because that's pretty much all it is. Those the four positions. Yeah, we'll talk about defense eventually, but I mean, those four positions right there, you got to make sure your players are in those good positions to get some points, especially when you're going through the draft. But throughout the season, when you're thinking about which guys to pick up off the waivers, you probably will be told that, or you'll think about it. You'll listen to Matthew Berry or me when I tell you who I think my hot player of the week is. So that's going to wrap it up for the second segment. And third segment, we're going to talk about Tom Brady a little bit and some other quarterbacks that are coming to the end of their careers but still can have a great fantasy year this year. We'll be right back with that. All right.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA Podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Football or Fantasy Football Podcast. This is Fantasy Football. We're trying to build your best roster to get you the most points to win your league, whether it's PPR, not PPR, or like one of those keeper leagues where you get to pick one of those players. I think I'm doing that this year where I get to keep one of my players. Ooh, who am I going to pick? I don't know. I think Todd Gurley maybe, but running backs are weird. I don't know. Maybe just Aaron Rodgers. See where they can bounce back with a good season after getting injured for much of last season. Speaking of quarterbacks, the position that Rodgers plays, I'm just going to talk about this segment. We're going to talk about some aging quarterbacks who still put up decent numbers. I mean, I talked about it a little earlier, a little bit about Drew Brees. He's staying with the New Orleans Saints. He's probably got about maybe 3 or 4 more years. We also have a Big Ben, who I ran with for a while last year, put up some points because he's got some serious weapons. If you're a Big Ben and you have Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, you can be a dangerous fantasy player because those guys can pretty much catch everything you throw with them and are going to put some good yards of the catch, and they might even get in the end zone. And then obviously Big Ben throws Ben Roethlisberger throws a very, very nice deep ball. So how to think about that. The main guy I want to talk about is the GOAT, Tom Brady. Never really been the number one fantasy player. I mean, he's a very solid fantasy player. He puts up some good numbers, but then the way the Patriots kind of run their offense is that they might not ask Tom to do too much in certain matchups. Bill Belichick obviously very methodical about what he wants to do with his offense, with Josh McDaniels over there as his offensive coordinator. So they might not put Tom under or ask too much of Tom. They might pass. I mean, they don't really pass from the inside the 5-yard line too much. They usually let their running backs take care of that. So, I mean, if you're a Patriots running back, that's a good little team to be on because you're going to get a lot of touches out of the backfield. They throw a lot to their running backs. I mean, we'll see what Dion Lewis can do now that he's left the Patriots. But I like James White. I like to see who can do who's going to replace, who's going to pick up those points for the Patriots, and see what they can do coming this season. But regarding Tom Brady, whether he's got 1 or 2 or even 3 years left, we'll see if he can still keep putting up these numbers. They obviously have gotten his 2 main weapons from last year, Brandon Cooks and Danny Amendola, are no longer on the team. We'll see if he can keep putting up the same numbers. He's always got his safety man and his safety blanket in Gronk. I mean, never gonna go wrong with Gronk. I mean, he's gonna help you out there. He's gonna make some catches if he can stay healthy. That's the thing. He needs to be able to stay on the field, and if he can do that, I mean, Tom Brady's always gonna have a target to go after when it comes to red zone, especially red zone plays and getting in the end zone. So, if you like the Gronk Brady connection, you're going to have to hope Gronk stays healthy, obviously, and then you're going to like Tom Brady coming out to be your quarterback to rack up some points. But that's the only issue, is that I don't think he gets enough, not every week to week. It's hard to get consistency with him sometimes because he's not going to always get the same kind of game plan when it comes to the offensive passing game, whether they're going to rely on the passing game a lot or if they're going to go more of the running game and just kind of go back and forth. He's just going to have more of an average day. Because that's the thing with fantasy points. They obviously add up, but he can have a nice solid quarterbacking day, but he might not have a good fantasy day. He might be 23 for 30 from the pocket throwing the ball for 300 yards, but he might have 1 touchdown or 2 or none, because they might get up close to the line of scrimmage or to the goal line and just run it in, or they might have a big running play. So he might not have a touchdown, or might just have 1 touchdown. He did that a lot last year. He did that a lot last year, where he had games where they would win, but he didn't really rack up the points or get the points himself. It was other parts of the offense. They were able to get the points, like James White and Dion Lewis were able to run it in, whoever it may be. So I mean, they also had Rex Burkhead, who was a good little fantasy player too. I had to pick him up late in the season. He got me a couple points before he got hurt again, going into the playoffs. But there's also a couple other quarterbacks. We talked about Big Ben, talked about Drew Brees. I like Drew Brees. He's always been a great fantasy player. He's obviously still got some weapons. He threw it a lot to Kamara last season. We'll see if he does the same thing this season with Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram. We talked about them fact that they're that duo of running back. Usually you don't like seeing your starting running back having to share carries, but if you have those 2 guys, I mean, it makes it a lot easier because they just can rack up the points even on lesser touches. I mean, I think Kamara, he probably still averaged maybe about 15, 20 touches last year a game, but he would be able to put up major numbers because he would have these big breakout plays, whether it's getting in the end zone or maybe like a 40-yard chunk play or a 25-yard chunk play. So those are right there. Those are big points right there, especially if it's out of the backfield, like we keep talking about all show, is the fact that these running yards are more valuable than the yards through the air, of course. So you get more points. So that's why you want to talk about aging quarterbacks. You want to have one that maybe has the better weapons around the outside, which is definitely Big Ben, definitely Drew Brees has. Tom Brady, though, he is the GOAT. He is the greatest quarterback. He's done the most with the littlest. I mean, the one year he actually had a great receiver in Randy Moss. They broke the record for touchdowns in a season. I mean, he still has Gronk. Gronk has some health issues. Gronk's got to stay healthy. and to be able to give Brady a chance to have a big fantasy season. I think this year, I think the 1 year that Gronk stayed healthy, Brady did have a big breakout fantasy year because they were hooking up a lot, especially in the red zone and getting Brady those red zone touchdowns, because that's what I think Belichick likes to do. Belichick, if he has Gronk, he'll throw inside the 10-yard line. If he doesn't have Gronk, he usually will run it and use their zone blocking scheme, use their great offensive line to try and get a touchdown on the ground. So Gronk is definitely the key to getting Brady a more consistently high-scoring fantasy year. So you have to kind of be wary of that, whether if you're thinking about picking Tom Brady this year or if you're a Patriots fan and you pick Tom Brady every year anyways. So I will get off my soapbox on that one regarding Brady, but I mean, you just got to be careful, obviously. Every year, fantasy's very fluid. It's all about those hot points. You got to make sure you get those guys when they're going good. There's some I'll have a couple episodes probably coming up soon here where I'm thinking about quarterbacks who I'm going to pick to be my maybe my little sleepers or maybe my breakout stars of the year, comeback player of the years regarding fantasy, whether they're on a new team or not. I mean, you have to think about some other players who are going to be fighting back from injury, like Ryan Tannehill, who's always been a little solid fantasy player. He's got the other guy where he's going to get some yards on the ground, maybe from his little scrambles, but then also he tends to find people in the end zone as well. They like to throw it in the end zone over down there in Miami. So Ryan Tannehill, little preview, but again, he's coming back from an injury, so you got to think about that too. Well, we're getting through this third segment. We're talking about some second tier quarterbacks earlier in this episode. Now we're talking about more quarterbacks that are on the last legs of their career. We kind of identified two of them, or three of them, the ones that are actually going to get you some points. Regarding the, I mean, we'll see what the Giants do. I don't know what they're going to do in the draft. I don't know what they're going to do with ODB. I mean, regarding that, I mean, you don't know what Peyton Manning's going to do. We're still talking about quarterbacks that are finishing up their careers. Peyton Manning is Peyton Manning. I keep saying Peyton Manning. Eli Manning. Eli Manning is going to do. He's finishing up his career with the Giants, Hall of Fame career, but I mean, he's never really been that. He had some great days. He has some great days fantasy-wise, but he has some really, really bad days too. I mean, I think there was a day I think I saw one time this year where he scored a whopping 2 points. Whether it was from interceptions and negative points or the fact that he just didn't have that many completions or they didn't throw the ball that much, you got to be real careful with Eli because, I mean, he's just going to be somebody that you need to stay away from. Probably he usually doesn't get drafted. I've never seen him get drafted in a long time. He's never really had enough. He's had the weapon. I mean, you can draft Odell Beckham. Obviously, he's way up there in those draft boards because he gets us a lot of catches, but that's about it when it comes to Eli. You better hope he can get Odell Beckham open and find him early and often throughout the whole rest of the game. But just like we were saying, preaching before, the fact that you need to get some serious consistency. You need to get consistency up and down the roster, up and down the whole season. And if you can do that, you're going to find yourself at the top of your league at the end of the year. So I don't think that Eli really does that for you. You got to think about how he's getting older and how he kind of regressed last season, obviously even getting benched. But there is a new regime in New York. You can think about how that might affect Eli and how Odell Beckham, if he's coming back healthy from his injury, is going to be affecting his scores coming up for this season. So Eli, a quarterback, I guess, to watch, but just finishing up these quarterbacks that are probably finishing up their careers in the next few years here. He's on that lower level, probably one of the last ones I'd think about. But the other three are so far up. It's really interesting, though, because you guys still have Brady, you still have Breeze, and you still have Big Ben, who are just such great fantasy players. They have all the weapons. They have all the ability to rack up those points because they have the ability to rack up a lot of points on the scoreboard as well. So when the team scores, usually your quarterback scores because he's going to be throwing a lot of touchdowns. That's kind of how the correlation works, unless you have a guy who a team where the guy running back had 3 touchdowns, but that's kind of a once a week once a season kind of thing that happens, or if you're me, once every 2 weeks for Todd Gurley. All right, that's the end of this. We're going to wrap up our third segment. We talked about kind of the second tier quarterbacks earlier. Now we talked about like those quarterbacks on their last legs of their career that are still probably have some good fantasy implications. In the last segment, we're talking about some more receivers and some tight ends to look at as we come into this offseason, go through this offseason. We're not close to the end of this offseason, but in football, there really is no offseason. We've got the draft coming up. We're getting through free agency. We have new players and new teams. So we should probably go through some players with the new uniforms this year and see how they're going to do with their new fantasy fits. We'll do that when we come back. All right.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I don't know if I mentioned before, but all of our podcasts, just like this one, are brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. So, in the previous segments, we did talk about the upcoming draft and the implications for your fantasy football leagues and possible picks that you might make with the coming rookies class coming in here. Then we talked about some of our second-tier quarterbacks. Obviously, we kind of know what our first-tier quarterbacks are. They're the same every year. I mean, we got our Rodgers and our Breezes and our Bradys and our Big Bens who put up big numbers. Even Matt Stafford, I would put up there. Matt Ryan. Who's our second tier, though? Our second-tier fantasy quarterbacks, we went over that in the second segment. Then we kind of went over the quarterbacks that are coming to the end of their careers but are still putting up some darn good fantasy numbers. I mean, you got, like I said, even before, Breeze and Brady were in that realm. You got Big Ben. Still putting up fantasy numbers, still winning leagues for people. All right, now we're going to get to some of the new faces and new places and their matchup probabilities and probabilities and how they're going to fare on their new teams, I think, when it comes to fantasy. So we obviously have the first big one was Allen Robinson going to the Bears. That's going to be interesting because he's going from a younger quarterback in Blake Bortles to another younger quarterback in Mitchell Trubisky. So, I mean, Mitchell Trubisky, he's more of your prototypical passer. Bortles more your game manager, but he also can run a little bit. Trubisky coming from University of North Carolina had a great rookie season. Everybody liked the way he looked, really proving that he earned that third pick. So it's going to be interesting to see how Allen Robinson fits into that offense. I mean, they do like to run the ball a lot there in Chicago. He was a pretty good fantasy player last year when it came to the Jaguars. Got some good touches, got in the end zone a bunch. I mean, because he can make those nice catches down the sideline and a great talent on the outside. But we'll see how he's going to match up in that NFC North going up against likes of the Packers and then having to play that Vikings defense twice. So I might want to stay away from him. You might want to go towards him. I don't know how you're feeling with your fantasy. I probably would stay away a little bit. It's his first season. He's coming back off injury. First season with the new team. Got a younger quarterback. They're probably going to give another year for Mitchell Trubisky to kind of run the ball more with Howard. And with their Cohen, they have a couple of good running backs back there, good nice little tandem. So I don't know. Allen Robinson, might probably want to stay away from him a little bit coming into this draft, or maybe find him later in your draft, or maybe if there's a matchup, if he does drop into the free agent market after the draft, he's going to be a good, nice little pickup later, or if somebody does draft him and then eventually drops him, I'd pay attention for that, watch that out. So he could pop, but I mean, the likeliness is that he is going to have a little growing pains with the new team. Next, is the most recent transaction. We had breaking news yesterday that the New England Patriots traded away Brandon Cooks to the Rams. Rams have had a plethora of new acquisitions, mostly other than Cooks. They've been on the defensive side, so we can talk about that in just a second. But Brandon Cooks on the Rams, that's going to be a nice little fit because he's going to have Jared Goff. They're going to have the complement with Gurley. He's going to be a speed guy getting in there with Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. So he's going to be that guy in the slot there, but have to take the top off the defense if he's going to be on the faster side, on the stronger side, a speed guy. And then obviously Jared Goff throws that nice deep ball. So I would still like Brandon Cooks. Had a great year last year with Tom Brady in that same kind of big offensive package. This year with the Rams, with Sean McVay, that kind of offensive guru, who's going to probably find a way to get him a lot of touches, whether it's going to be around end arounds. I mean, he can even do that in the running game, where he's going to come around on those big jet sweeps or whatever it may be, end arounds that can get him more of those valuable ground points. But through the air, he's a big game receiver, big play receiver. He likes to get in the end zone, scores a lot of touchdowns. I mean, you saw it last year with the first year with the quarterback and Brady. He's going to be another year where he's going to have to get on the same page as a quarterback for the first time in Jared Goff. I mean, I'm not comparing Brady and Goff; they're completely on two different spectrums there, but both talented guys. Obviously, they throw nice balls, nice deep passes, and Brandon Cooks can definitely has the speed to separate from his defender and get away from him. So we'll have to think about that. Getting over to their side of the Rams, we have their defense and the new acquisitions over there with the bringing in the trade for the Chiefs. Wow. The Chiefs cornerback, Marcus Peters, coming over, and then obviously with the Aqib Talib and the signing of Ndamukong Suh. So if you like defense and you'd like to get some points from defense, you might want to think about the Rams because they're probably going to get some points with those in that turnover game. You have Suh, who's going to be running out of the quarterback, trying to force fumbles. You got two cornerbacks who like to ball hawk and go for those interceptions. I mean, those two guys have been up there in the interceptions. They've been playing against each other in the AFC West for a while now. Now they're going to be on the same team on opposite sides of the field, trying to shut down those receivers. But the Rams, that's a nice little team. I mean, obviously, if you're going to think about a team to kind of stack up some players on the running in your fantasy team, I would think about the Rams. I mean, obviously, they're that kind of team now that went after those to become that super team to get those big offensive. The big defensive names, big name players. I mean, in the NFL, we haven't really seen that mercenary type of build of a team where you're just kind of getting these guys from other teams and building it piece by piece. Usually, you want to build up to the draft and develop. That's what's kind of worked in the NFL in the past. But the Rams are going to try and win now. They got a new stadium to build. They got some season tickets to sell, so they're going to try and win now. Obviously, they got a cheaper quarterback they can try and sell or try and just skew their salary cap the other way and go for some bigger names on the other side of the football. And if you're like that fantasy-wise, you like that defense, I would go after them with your defensive pick. Maybe jump that defensive pick in the early rounds. So, not that early, but just early rounds. Maybe be that first pick in the draft. They'll probably be highly rated, but when all those draft ratings come out, they'll probably be up there in the draft rankings for defense. All right. Getting some more new players. Obviously, we have Odell Beckham has yet to leave the Giants. I don't think he's going to leave the Giants. I mean, we have Jordy Nelson now going over to the Raiders. That's going to be interesting. Him and Derek Carr. That might be a good, nice little hookup. Jordy Nelson coming to the close of his career. The Packers thought he was a little too expensive to keep around. I guess so they let him go. The Raiders gave him a cute little deal, and then he's going to be now with Derek Carr, and that may be an interesting little hookup. Obviously, they still got Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper might draw more defensive players, so you might see Jordy Nelson running around there free. He likes to get in the end zone. He's got the good elusiveness, so he's definitely been a good fantasy player in the past. He could definitely have a bounce back year if he could just stay healthy. It's always about staying healthy. I mean, you got to think about that in the NFL. We talked about it before, injuries. The fact that they can be a killer for a NFL team, they can be a killer for a fantasy team. So you got to think about that, whether he's going to actually get drafted in in your drafts. For a 12-man league, he probably would get drafted. For an 8-man league, he might not. You might see him fall through to free agency and just be on a guy that you can pick up through waivers and bounce around to a couple different teams. Regarding Jordy Nelson to the Raiders. So we're thinking about some more of these guys that have gone over. The Texans, they did get Tyrann Mathieu. That's on the defensive side, not as quite as the individual pick there you're thinking about when you're thinking about individual players. But the Texans defense still looking pretty good. Obviously, same thing about injuries we're talking about just a second ago. You got to stay healthy. If those guys, Jadeveon Clowney can stay healthy, if J.J. Watt can stay healthy, you got Honey Badger, you got Randy Merciless, that's going to be a pretty nasty defense as well. So probably sitting up there with the Rams in those defensive rankings for the pre-draft rankings. So something to think about over there when him coming over from Arizona. You got Jarvis Landry going to the Browns, depending on what the Browns quarterback situation is going to be, whether they're going to stick with Tyrod for 1 year or go right with whoever they draft, whether it's Sam Darnold or somebody else. If they're going to throw Sam right in there, or if they're going to have him sit behind Tyrod, you're going to have Jarvis Landry in there for the first year in Cleveland. It's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do with him. He's been a good fantasy player in Miami. They've been a team that kind of has its ups and downs. Never really been the playoff. They haven't quite been a playoff team yet. But then nothing in comparison to the poor Browns, who just have had 1 one win in the last 2 years. So usually when you win, you have good fantasy numbers. But there's been Browns players that put up good numbers. Duke Johnson was a favorable running back. He puts up good numbers. They don't have to win every time, and he can have a good game fantasy wise. So you got to look at Jarvis Landry. Obviously, he's a very talented receiver out of LSU, coming over from Miami, and now going to be playing in Cleveland. The interesting thing is you're going to see how he adapts to that different weather, and still having to run his routes if he get put up the same kind of points with those new routes. Tyrod Taylor, another name we didn't mention. We're talking more about receivers, but now a quarterback who's actually he's an interesting little quarterback. I've seen him a lot. For fantasy wise, at least maybe not translate to wins on the field, but wins in your fantasy league is not a terrible little option if you're having your starter that you drafted on a bye, or if he's hurt, if you're looking for somebody to pick off waivers, or maybe draft late in the rounds. If you're a bigger league, a 12-man league, Tyrod Taylor on the Browns, he's going to, like I said, he's going to have those weapons. He's going to have Josh Gordon. He's going to have Corey Coleman. He's going to have Jarvis Landry. He's got two good little running backs in the backfield. They've gotten better on the defense. We'll see if they can maybe get Bradley Chubb. They obviously have Myles Garrett, so he's going to have a little defensive help on the backside. With Tyrod, if he gets that start for this year, if they sit that rookie behind him for 1 year, he might be an interesting little player because he's obviously played in the cold before up in Buffalo, and he's actually had some pretty good games. He's had, I think, 3 or 4 touchdown games, and he also is another guy. We like those running quarterbacks when we're thinking fantasy because they put up those points on the ground, and those put up those more valuable running points. So he's going to be definitely an interesting thing to think about on a new team there. Think about more quarterbacks on new teams. We got Case Keenum. He's not the best fantasy choice, I would think. He's more of a game manager. Doesn't really rack up those points. But however, Kirk Cousins, though, we talked about Kirk Cousins a little bit earlier. But Kirk Cousins when we talked about Minnesota, we kind of did a whole Minnesota little talk there for a minute in the first segment. But getting over to Kirk Cousins, because he's a new guy, he counts as these new players getting on new teams. He's going to be interesting. He's going to have a lot of help. He's going to have a lot of talent on the outside. He's going to have a lot of talent in the backfield to throw to. So he's got a good arm. He's had great stats. He's thrown up some serious games when he was on the Redskins. I think I've seen him throw up a 53-point game, 54-point game, depending on what kind of scoring your league does. But I definitely would think of him as a kind of a late round pick. I wouldn't put him as my starter. I wouldn't pick him in the top 4 rounds. Whenever you decide you want to pick your quarterback, I would probably wait and see if he drops. So maybe the 10th round or so, or depends how many rounds you go, because usually you go about 14 rounds with fantasy. So about even the last round of fantasy. That's when I got Ben Roethlisberger last year. So thinking about Kirk Cousins, this is going to be interesting to see if he can translate what he did in Washington into the same kind of thing in Minnesota. He's going to have more, like I said, he's going to have more talent, and he's going to be throwing indoors. He's already got a big arm, But I mean, a new system with Mike Zimmer, and he's going to have to figure that out and see if it could translate to fantasy. I think he will. I think he should be just fine. I think he should be just fine going over to the Vikings. He'll probably just continue putting up good numbers, even better numbers, because like I said, he's going to have those weapons over there in Minnesota. All right. We're coming up to the close of the show here. We did have a good one here talking about fantasy football. Obviously, we're at the beginning of April. We're pretty far off from your drafts, but we do have the NFL draft coming up here. So we talked a lot about the rookies at the beginning of the show. Then we talked about kind of your second-tier quarterbacks you might like if you're in a bigger league and all those top tier quarterbacks are gone already and you might have to just settle with somebody else, a younger guy. We talked about these older guys. They're going to be finishing up their careers in the next few years here, but are still racking up those fantasy numbers unless they're Eli Manning. But no, like the Tom Brady's and the Breezes and the Roethlisbergers. Those guys are up there in the years served here in the NFL, but they still like to score. They still like to get those big fantasy games. So you got to think about those guys. And then we also talked about these new guys and new faces. We talked about the Vikings. We talked about the Rams, and we talked about kind of the running back situation about where are you going to get value in the running backs. All right, so that'll close it out for today. I'm your host, Tom Dougherty. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, as always sponsored by the GSMC Podcast Network, that is. And everybody have a good day. I will see you next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.